Good morning, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, my name's Jody Sears. I'm the Director of Application Processing at Federal Student Aid, and that's the area in Federal Student Aid that oversees FAFSA testing before it goes out to the public. We also oversee FAA access to CPS online. Hopefully that's a tool you're familiar with, but if you're not, we're going to talk about that and show you some demonstrations of that particular tool. And we're also responsible for the management and the requirements for the central processing system, the CPS, where FAFSAs, when they're submitted, go to get processed. That's what we're going to cover today. Okay. I was not here in time to do the tech test, so there we go. All right. I have a lot to cover in 45 minutes, so I will tell you in advance, I won't have time to take questions, but I'm going to be here all day, so if you do have questions, please come see me. I'll take your card. If you have questions I can't answer right away or that will take a longer time to answer, I'll make notes on your card and I'll respond to you after the conference or during the conference when I have some time to email you. So I apologize, this is going to be pretty fast-paced, but I do want to make sure that I get your questions. I was talking to somebody just before this, and I was looking out at the crowd, and I thought to myself, do they really know what they got into? Did you know what you signed up for? There's a lot of information, but this is a really good profession, and you're really helping students be able to realize their dreams, to be able to go on and have professions, and glad you're here. I'm glad you're here for this training. All right, for the central processing system, I'm used to moving around, so I'm going to have to stay pretty close to the mic here. For the central processing system, there are three major things that I want to cover. I want to talk about eligibility determination. I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time on the function and the process of eligibility determination. Then we're going to talk about the various edits that we have to go through in order to get to a point within the CPS to calculate the EFC, the Estimated Family Contribution, that all-important index that shows on the first page of the process FAFSA results that you receive. And then we're going to talk about, how we disseminate that information. Once the FAFSA is processed, we disseminate the information to schools and students and other stakeholders in the financial aid process. After I talk about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources, because I'm going to be talking about edits and match flags and all those kinds of things. There's no way you're going to be able to remember all of that information. So we're going to talk about resources that you can always have on hand to help you be able to manage the ISIR data that you get in and help you manage when you have certain edits that appear on student records or match flags that aren't good match flags. How do you manage those? How do you help your students be able to resolve those issues? And I'll show you where those resources are. And then the last part of the presentation, I want to talk to you about a tool I'm very excited about. How many of you have already seen our demonstration tool for FAFSA on the web and FAA access? Oh my goodness, just a few of you. You're gonna love this. This is such a good training tool, not only for new financial aid administrators, but once you guys, are fully trained and you have to onboard new staff, this is a great onboarding tool as well. And it's also great for continuing education. So every year when we introduce new functionality on FAFSA on the web or FAA access, you'll be able to reference that demonstration tool. You'll have dummy data to play with and be able to work through scenarios for training purposes on your own campus. So I think you'll really like that. All right, we're jumping right in. What I wanted to do first is just kind of give you a visual representation of how the CPS is organized. So you can see the CPS is in kind of the center of a process that allows us to issue billions of dollars of aid to millions of students. It's kind of the central point of that process. And as you can see, we have a section where the FAFSA applications, the submission of the FAFSA applications go into the CPS. The CPS does several things to process that information. We do eligibility determination, which if you look at the bottom, it would have been so much more fun to have me on the floor, but then I couldn't click. But anyway, you'll see the match flags on the matching that we do to do eligibility determination. Then once that's done, we do additional editing to determine, what EFC methodology we're going to use to calculate the student's EFC, verification selection, and so on, and then we disseminate those results. So that's the primary role of the CPS, to do eligibility determination, to calculate the EFC, and to disseminate the results so that you guys can process financial aid on your campuses. I wanted to zero in just on the FAFSA application process for just a moment. It's important to know, since submitting a financial aid or a FAFSA application is the beginning of the financial aid life cycle, that's where everything starts. So the most common way to submit a FAFSA is for the student and parent to go to FAFSA on the web and just submit it from their laptop. Most recently, we've made it easier to use your mobile phone. So if you just go to FAFSA.gov from a mobile phone, you'll find that everything is to scale on the mobile phone and it works really well. Or a student can download the mobile app and there's additional functionality in that mobile app if they want to save that to their phone. So that's the most common way that a FAFSA is submitted. That's really good because when a student is on one of our products like FAFSA on the web, we have editing that happens while the student is entering information. So in those end of entry edits, we're catching inconsistencies in their information. For instance, if the student says that their parents are divorced, when it comes time to answer questions about the parent financial information, we're going to make sure that we're only collecting the information for one parent. Student can't, make some inconsistencies in that way. We're also making sure that, only the right characters are in the right fields and so on. So that end of entry edit allows for that FAFSA to be submitted to CPS with fewer errors. Another way that a FAFSA can be submitted is through FAA access to CPS online. Not that most schools would do that, but if you had an exception reason why you wanted to submit an application on behalf of a student or a student and parent, you have an ability to do that through FAA access. Schools also have software on their campuses where they may also be able to submit a FAFSA online using the school software, but we also still have the paper process. And you might be wondering, why would we still have a paper process? For the 17 to 20 million applications that we receive every year, about 0.3% are paper applications. There's a couple of reasons why we will always have to have that paper process. It could be that a part of the country maybe had a natural disaster and that's knocked out the ability to be able to do things electronically. There are instances where certain families or some students just don't have access to the technology to be able to submit something online. So we will always have that paper process available. The reason I'm pointing that out is because we can't control the data entry that a student does on a paper FAFSA. So when that paper FAFSA is submitted, it goes to our image data capture center and it's converted to an electronic record, but it's very possible the student provided inconsistent information. So on rarer instances, we still have to have edits in place that maybe will reject edits that will not allow us to calculate an EFC. So I just wanted to point that out. You will rarely encounter those because there's just not that many paper applications, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware. Okay. The next thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is talking about eligibility determination. So once those FAFSA records are sent into the CPS, the first step in processing is doing the eligibility determination part. And basically what that is the CPS sending out pieces of data from the records that we receive to other agencies like Social Security, Selective Service, Department of Homeland Security, for example. And we are going to match against that data, and depending on how the matches work, we'll be able to make a determination that the student is or is not eligible for federal student aid. If there is an issue with any one of those matches, we're going to provide a SAR comment to the student and, of course, to the financial aid office so that you're informed about what match issue has failed and what needs to be done in order to resolve it. I did want to spend a little bit of my time walking you through each one of those matches so that you have a better understanding of the process of eligibility determination, because that will help you understand better what the process is and be able to help your students if you have an issue where you have to remediate. So we're going to go over the matches. The first one is what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. The first thing we do is we have to send every student record, if the student has never applied before, to the Social Security Administration. We have to check to be sure the Social Security number, the name, and the date of birth exist in that combination on the Social Security file. If there's any issue with that, say the student miskeyed their Social Security number, or the parent entering it for the student miskeyed the Social Security number, or they have a set of twins and they get the Social Security numbers mixed up, all of this happens. We will provide a SAR comment to let the student know that, hey, we weren't able to validate your identity based on the name, Social Security number, and date of birth that you provided. Check those fields, see if there's a typo, or see if there's information that you need to change. There are instances where there's a problem with Social Security on the Social Security file that the student is going to have to correct with the Social Security Administration, but you'll be able to see that through the SAR comments and through the conversation that you have with the student. The other thing that we match against when we do the Social Security match is if the student says, I am a U.S. citizen, Social Security will be able to validate if they are a U.S. citizen. If they weren't able to validate that the student is a U.S. citizen, again, they'll receive a SAR comment that lets them know that and what they need to do to resolve the issue. The other thing we do is match against the death master file to be sure that the Social Security number that's identified for that student isn't actually identified with the deceased person. There are instances where that comes up, the student is very much alive, that really is their Social Security number. They have to go to the Social Security Administration to resolve those kinds of issues. One thing I wanted to point out about this is once a student, say they're a freshman, they apply for their FAFSA for the first time and they get a good match from Social Security, the next year, say in their sophomore year when they're ready to fill out their next FAFSA, they're eligible for a renewal FAFSA. That renewal FAFSA, and the student will see a message that says, hey, you already filed last year, would you like to do a renewal FAFSA? That means that there's fewer data elements that you'll have to fill in because we can bring over some of the information from the prior year. I think there's like 57 fields in total that are able to come over. But one of the things that we also carry over is the match flag from Social Security so that we don't have to send that record to Social Security again in future years. So I just wanted to point that out. The next thing I want to point out is selective service. We only send records to selective service for match for students who are 17 to 25 years old and have identified their gender as male or they didn't identify their gender at all. In those cases, we send all of those records to selective service. The student will identify on the FAFSA that they're either registered with selective service or they're not registered, and please register me. So when we send over that information, we will either verify that they're registered. If they're not, they'll get a SAR comment that tells them you're not registered with selective service, this is what you need to do. Or if the student said, I'm not registered, please register me, we will register them with selective service during that match. And again, that's another match flag that we would carry over with the renewal, so we don't have to send the record back in the subsequent years. The next match I want to talk about is Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. We only send records to DHS for students who identify that they're an eligible non-citizen and provided their alien registration number. And we match against their system. If we get a good match back, we provide that information on the student aid report. If we don't get a good match on the first try, we actually hold that record for 3 days, and then we attempt a second match. And usually then the record will match. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay in the system, so that's why we hold them for 3 days. If after the second attempt we don't get a good match, we will send the record back indicating that the match wasn't successful and essentially the steps that need to be taken in order to resolve that. There is a step that some schools need to do. It's called third step verification for about 30,000 students a year. So when you consider there's about 6,500 institutions, you may or may not ever encounter this issue. But there is a process for third step verification, and I would recommend that you attend the general conference that talks about the FAFSA on the web and CPS updates, because that third step verification process will be discussed in that session. But again, we only send those records where the student has identified eligible non-citizen and have their alien registration number. The next one I want to talk about is the Veterans Administration. We don't have a lot of records that go to the VA for match, and I want to explain just a little bit about this. The only records that will ever go to the VA for match are when the student identifies that they're a veteran, when they're answering the dependency questions, so they may never see this question. In other words, as soon as a student indicates one reason why they are independent, whether it's their age, they're married, they have a child, they have a bachelor's degree, all of those things, once they identify the reason they're independent, they're not presented the other questions. So by the time the student makes it down to the list where they're finally answering yes to being a veteran, and that's the one thing that makes them independent, that's the record we're going to send to the VA to match, to validate that they are a veteran, because that means that they're independent and we can validate that. All right, two other matches that we do that are performed a little bit differently than the other matches we discussed. The other matches I've discussed is where we send data to that external system to match against their database. These two particular matches, the Department of Justice file and the DoD file, we actually get files from those agencies that we put into the CPS. And we run matches against all the new records that come in, plus all the records that have already been processed every day. And the reason for that is that file, every time we get it, the information on that file could change. So people who've already been processed will need to be continually matched against that just to see if there's been a change. So for the Department of Justice, hopefully you will go your entire career and never see a match on this. We have about 10 matches a year. The records that are in the Department of Justice file are those persons who are denied federal student aid due to a drug abuse conviction. So again, we have very, very few matches on this. And they're not eligible. They'll get a SAR comment that tells them that they're not eligible for federal student aid until their sentence expires. And if for some reason a record is already processed and they didn't have a match on the DOJ file, but we later get a new file where they are, we will system generate a transaction so that the school and the student know that something changed about their eligibility because of that match. The Department of Defense file is also a monthly file that we receive and we keep maintained in our CPS database. And it's a file that contains all the persons whose parent or qualifying guardian was a member of the armed forces and ultimately died as a result of injuries that they received in service in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. Excuse me. In those instances, we'll provide a SAR comment that lets a student know that they may be eligible for an additional grant, the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant. And again, we always are matching processed records just in case somebody ultimately matches anytime we get a new file from DoD. All right, one last match that we do is with the NSLDS, or the National Student Loan Database. And again, this is very important to eligibility determination as well, because we have to know for every record that's processed, we call that pre-screening, to verify that the student isn't in default, and we also look at how much of their, where they are with their annual loan limits, their aggregate loan limits, and also their Pell Lifetime eligibility limits. So we're always checking to give information to the student and to the school to let them know if they're in default or if they're getting close on their limits. We also do a post-screening on this as well, which means that once a record is processed and in the CPS database, we're going to continue to check against NSLDS, because as you know, NSLDS information can change, and it could happen that somebody's information in NSLDS and their financial aid history has changed, and that change impacts what they're eligible for. So we will system generate a transaction in those instances where a change in their financial aid history changes their eligibility for aid. So I wanted to just really focus on those eligibility determination factors, because those are the things that you often have to help students resolve. Now you have a little bit of background about what happens in those matches. I wanted to take a moment too. I'm not quite sure. I know most of you have been in financial aid for a year or less, so I'm not sure how many of you have actually handled ISIR data, the process FAFSA data that the school receives. But on an ISIR, we have a section called the FAA section. This is not a section that exists on the student aid report or the SAR that the student gets. This is just on an ISIR. But the area that I circled there is where we report all the match flag statuses. You're not going to know what match flag 1 means, or if it's a blank or a Y or an N or whatever. You're going to need to have documentation or operational guides to help you be able to understand what those flags are. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that would be found in the ISIR guide and the SAR comment guide, and those will give you guidance on how to manage match flags that aren't good match flags, or edits and different, what things trigger SAR comments and what you need to do to resolve them. But I just wanted to point out this particular section. All right, now that eligibility determination has been made and we can determine whether or not the matches were successful, and if the matches weren't successful, there's instances where we won't calculate an EFC. For instance, on somebody where we couldn't verify that their social security number, name, and date of birth, we're not going to be able to calculate an EFC for that person. That's why we do eligibility determination first. But once eligibility determination is done, now we're going into the compute process, where we do some basic editing. We determine, is this a dependent student or an independent student, because that determines which EFC model we're going to be using. Is there information based on how they answered marital status and different assets and different things about their family situation? Is this an auto zero EFC or a simplified needs test EFC model, that methodology that we have to follow for the EFC calculation for either a dependent or an independent? So there's 6 different methodologies that we would possibly use to calculate an EFC, and this basic editing helps us kind of section out which ones get which EFC methodology. Then we start looking at the data they've provided a little more closely. We do assumption edits. It is possible, I'll give you a real simple example. A student could say, I have a household size of 4, and when they answer how many are in college, they put 4. We're going to look at that and say, probably what you meant was household size of 4 and 1 in college. We will make an assumption, change the value to 1, and calculate the EFC based on our assumption. We will provide a SAR comment for the financial aid administrator and the student to say, hey, we made an assumption. Look for the fields with asterisk and verify. If our assumption was correct, you don't need to do anything. If our assumption was incorrect, then you're going to have to make a change. Another kind of edit that we have are warning edits. It's where the data could be a little wonky, a little questionable, and we want you, the student, and you, the financial aid administrator, to look at the fields that we've highlighted that seem questionable based on overall analysis that we do. And we provide, again, a SAR comment that lets you, the financial aid office, and the student know you need to look at these fields. We have reject edits, and again, reject edits are most likely something that would happen on a paper submission, not so much on something that a student submits through FAFSA on the web. There are 2 different kinds of reject edits. There are some that are verifiable. Those reject edits will be identified with a letter, and again, the ISIR guide will guide you through that. And then there are reject edits that are non-verifiable, that you're going to have to change something in order to get an EFC calculated. When a record has reject edits, we do not calculate an EFC. If the student has a verifiable reject, the student or the school can go in and re-enter information. An example would be, I believe, if you said you had 19 in the household. You could be the Duggars, could be true, but we're going to make you re-enter, because maybe you meant 9, not 19. But we'll make you re-enter that information. In essence, when you're re-entering that information, you're verifying, and we know for sure you've got the right information. Other reject edits that are non-verifiable are identified by a number. And again, you'll see the definitions of all the reject edits in the ISIR guide. An example of a non-verifiable reject is where the student, maybe on a paper application, said my parents were divorced, but provided financial information for both the mother and the father. We can't make an assumption. We don't know if the marital status is wrong or the financial aid or the financial information is wrong, so something has to happen that only the student or the school can fix. And then when you fix that, then we'll be able to calculate an EFC. All right, now that all the editing's done, we're now ready to do the EFC calculation with one of the 6 formulas. And after the calculation is done, we then do the verification selection. How many of you are familiar with verification selection? You kind of know what that is. How do you know a record's been selected for verification? What do you see on the first page? The asterisk next to the EFC, very good. One thing I forgot to mention, another thing, if there's ever a problem with a match, with one of the match flags, do you know what you see next to the EFC that tells you there's a match issue? SAR C flag. Yeah, Marie knows. It's a C flag. You'll see that next to the EFC as well. I meant to mention that earlier. But anyway, with verification selection, records that are Pell eligible with Pell eligible EFCs are subject to verification selection. There are two reasons why a record would be selected for verification. The most common reason is because that record met conditions that we've determined are likely error prone. In other words, we do tons of analysis on data. We watch correction behavior, we watch the timing of when corrections are made and the different combinations of the types of corrections that are made, and we can identify records that likely have an error prone issue. We will select those records for verification so that you, the school, and the student can go through the verification process and ensure that you have the right information for those very important elements that impact the EFC calculation. Another reason a record can be, and by the way, you will see in the FAA section on the ISIR, you'll see an area that says, was the record selected? It'll say yes, and then it'll ask the verification tracking flag. You'll see V1. That's error prone. That's the most common reason. Another reason a record can be selected for verification is for identity verification. In other words, there's something about that record that fits a model that we'll never share with anybody that could be an issue with identity fraud. So we're going to select that record for verification, and that student will have to bring in acceptable documentation about their identity. The one thing about that is you also have to report identity verification results through FAA Access. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Anyway, you'll note that a record's been selected for verification for identity verification. The tracking flag will be V4. If you see a tracking flag of V5, that's like not the trifecta, but the double whammy, I guess. That means that person was error prone and they fit the identity fraud model. So yeah, that person shouldn't buy a lottery ticket. That's really unlucky. So anyway, after we do verification selection, we do our final edits, and we are finally ready to disseminate the information. Typically, when a student submits their FAFSA application, we do a sweep later in the afternoon. We pick up those records, and most often we're able to provide the results the following day. The student submits on a Friday. You're not going to get the results until Monday. If there's a holiday in there, we don't process on holidays. I believe the ISIR guide gives you the processing dates whenever there's a federal holiday, the days we don't process. There are instances too where I mentioned we may hold a record for 3 days for DHS verification, but by and large, most of the time, it's the next business day that you'll have the results. All right, we're transitioning now to talk about resources. I have a little bit of information that I wanted to share in this area. How many of you are familiar with IFAP? You have that saved as your favorites. Do not have everybody's hand up. So on this slide, which hopefully you have copies of as well, I would save to your favorites ifap.ed.gov. This has all the resources that you need in order to manage the ISIR data that you receive and administer financial aid, not just for CPS, but also things related to COD and NSLDS and return of title for funds and all kinds of information that you need to have to do your jobs on a daily basis. So I'm just going to focus right now on the 4 boxes: tools for schools, worksheets, publications, and processing resources. Those are the things that you're going to use most often. Tools for schools actually lists a bunch of training materials. That should be the first thing you guys are clicking as new financial aid administrators. There's training for COD, for FAA Access, for EdExpress. There's all kinds of tutorials and things that are available for you. One of the other things that I wanted to point out is the FAA Toolkit, which is at fsatraining.ed.gov. And I wanted to just spend a minute here talking about this particular source. As new financial aid administrators, this particular resource is incredibly important to your training. And we expect you to know a lot of stuff as a financial aid administrator. The more you get into this, the more you're like, holy cow, look at all the stuff I need to know. This particular training source is going to be invaluable to you as new FAAs, and also for the new folks that follow behind you that you onboard. There is a place in the Resource Center, I think it's called e-training, is that correct, Holly? Is it called e-training in the Resource Center? Thank you. Please stop by there. If you're not familiar with FSAtraining.ed.gov. I encourage you to go there and learn more about what's available in there. This tool is very important. You set up an account, you'll have a user ID and a password. It will provide training and videos, how-tos, there's fundamentals training and various training things that will track as you know, if you can't finish a training in one sitting, it will track where you left off so that you can continue your training here. It's also a good place to type in questions that you have. You can search for resources to help you with the questions that you have. So this is a really important tool, and I would encourage you to stop by the Resource Center. It's open tomorrow. The next box I wanted to talk about is worksheets and schedules. This is important for when you have to, when a student is selected for verification. We have the verification worksheets here. If you have a student who's withdrawing the return of Title IV funds, also called R2T4, the worksheets are here to calculate what aid has to be returned. The Pell Grant schedules and disbursement schedules are here for all the open award years. And gosh, if you guys are dying to do an EFC hand calculation, worksheets are here. Who knew? But that is a good training exercise to see all the different components that make up the calculation. So I would encourage you to at least do one hand calculation. Another item here are publications, and this is really important. You see we have the publications in two different categories. General publications cover the rules of federal student aid and managing federal student aid and administering it, everything about audits and policy. You'll see the Federal Student Aid Handbook is here. That, again, should be another link that you are going to all the time. That's a really helpful resource. But all of the rules and regulations about managing and administering federal student aid. Then you have the processing publications. Those are more about the operations of the various systems that you have to interact with when you're administering financial aid. CPS, COD, NSLDS, FSA, all of those different systems that have operational resources and guidance for you. The ones that I wanted to point out here are that you'll see the ISIR guide, the SAR comments guide. That's where you get those copies. Again, I would have those saved on your laptop somewhere because that's a resource you're going to be using all of the time. The SAR comment guide is also handy because we give you the text for every one of the SAR comments that could ever appear on a processed FAFSA. We tell you what triggers set that comment, and we tell you if there's a resolution that needs to be taken, that needs to be looked at. We tell you what the resolution to resolve whatever that SAR comment is telling you to do. So it's a very helpful guide, especially for new FAAs. Another one that I wanted to point out is the very last one under processing publications, summary of changes. That's a guide you need to be looking for every year. We do enhancements and changes on FAFSA on the web and FAA Access, COD, all of those systems every year in order for you to be able to quickly assess what are the new things so that you can train your staff for the next award year. That summary of changes guide is a really important tool. Next, I kind of have two screens here. Let's see if I can use this pointer. This here is processing resources. When you click processing resources from the IFAP homepage, you'll see this screen right here, and you can select, I want processing resources for application processing, campus-based, SAR help, NSLDS materials or whatever. I selected application processing information because it's in my presentation. So, and I'm talking about CPS. So when you select from the processing resources, you want to look at the processing information for, say, application processing. This is what's presented to you. And this is where you get the information about who do I call when I have a question. I mean, why did I get this result on a FAFSA? I totally don't understand. I didn't get FAFSAs in my teaching mailbox today. What's going on? Or something isn't working as expected. You need to have a place to call. The CPS SEIG help desk contact information is here. Also signing up for FSA Tech Listserv. Is anyone signed up for FSA Tech Listserv? Okay, not everybody. That's a really important item to sign up for. It's really great because you'll see people posting operational questions, and you'll get to see the responses from the tech team answering those questions. That's also another way you can get questions answered. And you go here, and you'll be able to sign up for the FSA Tech Listserv. That's something that's well worth your time. All right, I don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to talk about the demo site. Many of you did not raise your hand that you're even familiar with this. This website right here, fafsademo.test.ed.gov, mark it down. This is the place to go. So I'm actually going to click in because I want to show you what's available to you. All right. This is a very long page here. I actually print this out on my desk because what we do is we have preloaded test data. You not only get to use FAFSA on the web and FAA Access, and it feels just like production, but it's not, but we've grouped together data that you can play with so that you can get more experience. In this case, we have preloaded test data. So remember when I was talking about renewal applications, you want to know what that's like when you enter in the information. You'll see the message that says, hey, you're eligible for a renewal FAFSA. Then you can click the, yeah, I want to do a renewal, and then you can see all the fields that are already pre-filled. So you get that experience, what the student will see through FAFSA on the web, or what you will see as an FAA if you want to do a renewal application for a student and FAA access to CPS online. The next thing you'll see is processed FAFSA information. In other words, for the current year, 2021, we have some applications that are already processed, dummy data. It's not real in any way, shape, or form. But you can use this information to practice, to go through scenarios. Do you want to see what it's like to make a correction in FAA Access? You'll have all the information you need with this dummy data that's here in order for you to look at a record that's already processed to practice making corrections in FAA Access. The same is true. You can use the same data in the FAFSA on the web demo tool as well. So you can see that we have all of our data grouped together. If you've never done a signature hold, you have a student who sent in a FAFSA but didn't sign it, or a parent didn't sign it, and you want to know how to do a signature hold release, you have the data here that's in the condition for you to do a signature hold release. So there's lots of training material here for you to just even branch out on your own or use it as a training for other staff in your school. So anyway, you can see there's lots of data that's available to you to be able to use. That's why I print it out, because I want to have that so I don't so I can look at it and then click into one of the tools. Here you'll see this is the demonstration site for FAFSA on the web, and then this is the one for FAA Access. Because I'm limited on time, I'm going to have to go back to my screenshots, but I wanted to show you here's where you access either one of those demo sites, and literally feels exactly like production, so you'll get a really good experience. One of the other reasons you want to use this is if you want to see what the student sees when they're filling out a FAFSA, you want to see what the help text says for each one of the questions, you can look at that without having to go to the production site. Same for FAA Access. One other thing I wanted to point out is we've also provided, so that you can do FAA Access, we've provided the pretend login credentials for an FAA here, which is what you'll need for FAA Access. All right, I'm going to go back to my slides so I can show you a couple of screenshots here. All right, when you click on the demonstration site for FAA Access, the first thing you're taken to is the FAA homepage. And this is just telling you the functionality that we have available for you. You can just look at a student's processed results. You can do an ISIR compare. That, to me, is something lots of financial aid administrators use all the time, where you have multiple transactions and you want to see the differences between transaction 1 and 3 or 2 and 3 or whatever. There's a compare function in there, and I'll show you how that works. If you need to fill out a FAFSA or a renewal for a student or do a correction for a student, you have that functionality here as well. Also entering identity verification results or doing an ISIR request. All right, after you click next from the home page, from that FAFSA main menu, you'll enter in your credentials, your pretend credentials, and then you're taken to the FAA main menu. Here's where you can click in to do the functions we just talked about. So I'm gonna, how much time do I have remaining? I just wanna, perfect, okay. Let's go through and at least let me show you the couple of the most used functionality here. Clicking in on ISIR or student inquiry, what you're going to be able to do, once you select student inquiry from the main menu, you'll enter in your login credentials. which I show you in that top screen, and then you'll enter in the student identifier information. So you'll enter the student's social security number, name, and date of birth, and make sure that you've selected the correct award year, and then you click Submit. And this is a page you're taken to. It's called the student transaction page. You can see in this case we have 3 transactions for this student, the original application and 2 correction applications. So if you just want to look at, say, the 3rd transaction, you can see this is highlighted like a link. You click on that, and then you're taken to that student's 3rd transaction. And you'll see here that we have, you're taken to the processing information, but you see here we've broken up the information so you can easily get to the section you want to look at. Whether you want to look at student information, their assets, parent information, or say their NSLDS information, the SAR comments that are associated with this particular record, or the FAA information. Remember I showed you that screenshot before. You can go directly to look at FAA information for that student. You can also print this if you needed to do that. If you decide that, gosh, I know exactly what correction I want to make on this record, all you have to do is click Corrections, and you'll be taken to the functionality that allows you to make a correction for that record and submit it. Okay, I'm going to go back. Let's say that you want to do ISIR compare. Let's say that I wanted to see the differences that exist between transaction 1 and transaction 2. I simply click those boxes, and because you can only compare 2 transactions at once. What you'll be taken to is this screen. Notice this first column here. This is every field on the FAFSA. The next column is all the responses the student provided in the first transaction you're looking at, and then all the students' responses of the other second transaction that you're looking at. And then this column is really awesome because when you click, this is like a live link, when you click difference, what it does is it takes all the fields that have differences between the answers and brings those to the top, so you can easily check and see what differences exist there. That's a really handy tool when you are trying to research issues or challenges that you may have on a student's record and then decide where you need to make any corrections or stop the student from making corrections on top of your corrections or whatever. So that's probably one of the most used functions in the FAA Access to CPS Online. Very quickly, I'm showing you the screens. If you select from the main menu that you want to fill out a FAFSA or a renewal for a student or do a correction for a student, you will enter the student's information, their social security number, name, date of birth, and if you are filling out, if the student is eligible for a renewal, it will tell you so. You can click on renewal, and there will be 57 fields that are filled in for you, so it'll make it a little easier. If the student isn't renewal eligible, you'll just begin entering in all the data for the FAFSA. This is what the data entry screens look like for FAFSA entry on FAA Access. It looks nothing like FAFSA on the web. And you're able to submit a FAFSA on behalf of a student. You collect their signature. You keep that on file. If you're making a correction, again, you're entering in all the information for the student, name, date of birth, social security number. You identify the transaction you want to correct, or you don't identify it and it just brings up the last transaction for you. What I wanted to show you here is this, the correction application will show you all the fields on the FAFSA. The next column shows you all the information that the student provided, and then you find the fields that you want to correct and you re-enter and add the corrected information in this field. You submit the correction at the bottom of the application. And the one thing I wanted to make sure I got in, and I'm going to just make it here, is you have to submit identity verification results through FAA Access. So whenever you get records that have the V4 or V5, you have to collect, you have to give us the results of your verification for that. Did the student show up or not? Did the student show up and provide you acceptable documentation? Did the student show up and wasn't able to provide you acceptable documentation? There's 6 different results that we need for you to report. It's very simple to fill this out. You select verification identity results from the main menu. You identify that you want to just enter the results. Typically, you're only going to have a handful, so just entering the social security numbers on the next screen here. You put in the first 2 letters of the last name, and you pick one of the 6 results from this drop-down box. You may only have 3 or 4 to submit. You fill that in, and then you submit the results. You finish your entries, then you hit submit. You'll get a confirmation page. If for some reason you have a whole bunch of these and it's easier for you to just create a text file, you can do that as well. You can just indicate that you want to download a file. We provide you all the guidance to make a file that you can upload for identity verification results. It's really easy. The first 9 fields you open up something like Notepad, you enter in the 9 fields for the social security number, first 2 letters of the last name, and 1 through 6 for whatever the identity results are. You save that to your server, your laptop, wherever. You upload that file, and you submit it. You'll get a confirmation page. So the submitting verification results is not a difficult process, but it is one that you must send in. And finally, one of our least used, and that's why I put it at the end, ISIR request. If you do want to manage how ISIRs come to your campus, if you have a really large campus and you want to maybe only get freshman ISIRs that are only for freshmen, or ISIRs for just dependent students or independent students, you can create a template to say, I only want these ISIRs to come to my mailbox today. So you decide the nature of the conditions of the ISIRs that you want to receive, and you may have staff assigned to only do certain one of those ISIRs, and this ISIR request functionality allows you to do that. So I am just about done on time here. I wanted to provide one last thing of the CPS SEIG Help Desk information. If you have questions about operations related to CPS, the phone number is here. Signing up for FSA Tech, also very, very good idea. But these are the questions that can be answered at the CPS SEIG Help Desk, and it's far easier and quicker to get your answer here than to call somebody you happen to know at the department. So you know, when folks give you their number at the department, that's not the number to call when you have operational issues. It will take a much longer time to get your answer. And yes, I have a couple of people saying, yes, thank you for saying that. You will get much better service this way. That concludes my presentation. I mentioned I will be available during break time or at the end of the day today. I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. Have your card ready. If I can't answer your question right away, I will respond later. Thank you so much.